Hello, everyone. Welcome to Deep Dive Wednesday. It's good to have you with us. If you've been watching the show, you know that on Wednesday, this is the day we invite an expert in-house to dig deep into a subject, an issue, a topic that is on our minds that's dominating the news. Again, if you've been watching the show for the last few weeks, you know that we've been focused on the issue of gender-based violence against women and girls, a lot of it triggered by the rape and murder of 5-year-old Khadija Sakor in Sierra Leone 3 weeks ago today, actually. My guest today is an acclaimed author and activist, anti-FGM activist. She's a British Somalian warrior, Nimco Ali, OBE, we should add, who's in the house, and we're going to be talking about FGM, its prevalence, why the fight to eliminate it has been so difficult, and where FGM fits in the broader context of violence against women and girls, and just talking about societies where it's prevalent, what we see, and how we tackle all of it. So we're going to have an expansive conversation about these issues. You know how this works on Wednesday. We want you to be part of the conversation. So start writing your thoughts, start writing your questions. Let's get started. Well, before we get to our guest, I do want to bring you an update on the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, as it's affecting Africa. With recent events here in the United States and around the world, the social justice movements, the fight for racial justice, it has kind of moved the pandemic from center stage in many places. But, you know, we do want to shine a light on what's happening in Africa and really make the point that it continues to spread. It continues to spread fast, and according to the WHO, it is now being driven primarily by community transmission, which shouldn't really surprise you given the fact that borders are closed. So what we are seeing is that in communities itself, the virus is spreading, and it is spreading quickly. According to the WHO, the number of deaths in Africa caused by coronavirus has now surpassed deaths caused by the 2014 Ebola pandemic, West Africa epidemic, rather, I should say. Let me put up those numbers on the screen. As you see there, total confirmed cases, over 500,000 cases now. Take that in for a second. Over 500,000 cases in Africa, 508,710. Active cases, about half of that, 250,888, and then the deaths there, 11,989. The thing I want to stress before we move on from coronavirus and welcome our guest is that we seem to be using the metric of death to basically make the point of how dangerous this virus is. That should not be the sole metric. This is a very dangerous virus that has long-lasting complications for people, and that is what we're seeing as more and more research is done, as more and more data comes out, that even if you're asymptomatic, there is an implication for your lungs and for your organs, and that is what research is showing. So I want us to move away from this notion that if you're not dying from this, then there's nothing to worry about. There's plenty to worry about. So wear the masks, wash your hands, maintain social distancing. Again, WHO says the numbers are going up. They're going up quickly, and there is a risk to everyone. So I just want to stress that point to you, that coronavirus is very much amongst us on the continent, and it's something we all must take seriously. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about the situation facing women and girls globally, but you know, we're going to focus a lot on Africa as part of this conversation. in the last few weeks, we have seen the most horrific headlines emerge in various places on the continent. You remember a few weeks ago in South Africa, an 8-month pregnant woman was found hanging from a tree, having been stabbed repeatedly. In Nigeria, a young woman who had sought solace in a church to study was found raped and murdered. She had been bludgeoned with a fire extinguisher. And then, of course, there's 5-year-old Khadija Sakor, the little girl from Freetown, Sierra Leone, who was repeatedly raped and strangled to death, allegedly by her own cousin. The headlines are horrifying, and they mask a deep problem. In Sierra Leone in 2019, there were 3,695 reported cases of sexual violence against women and girls, and those are just the cases that were reported. We want to talk about all of this, sexual violence. We want to talk about FGM and where that fits into things. I'm so pleased to have this woman with us today. She has been fighting on the issue of FGM for a very long time. Nimka Ali is the CEO and founder of the Five Foundation, the global partnership to end FGM. She's also author of a book with a great title, the title of What We're Not Told to Talk About, What We're Told Not to Talk About, but We're Going to Anyway. In that book, she spoke to 150 women around the world about periods, about sex, and so much more. And of course, FGM. She joins us now from London. Nimka, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
It's so good to have you here with us. I have been following you for a very, very long time, and just want to say thank you for the work you do and for being a tireless, fearless warrior. I want to start there. You have said that FGM was patriarchy's way of trying to break you. Can you unpack that statement? What do you mean by that?
I think, so FGM, well, first of all, thanks for having me. And FGM is the first form of oppression that is basically subjected upon girls specifically because of their gender. And one of the key things is that the fact that the patriarchy and many of these male-run systems are not interested in women's intelligence, women's ability to lead. What they want women is just to be sexual objects and objects that also produce children. So what FGM does is that in order to initiate you into womanhood, it initiates you with pain. And if that pain is meant to consume you, and then you're meant to be scared of ever, putting your head above the parapet. But I always say that my FGM happened, out of context, in the sense that even though my mother and my grandmother had a role in it, but they also still had a role in really empowering me and not making FGM something that was celebrated. So what I found was that rather than making me quiet and rather than trying to break me, FGM made me the loudest person in the room, because I was just completely stunned by this weird thing which had no context, both in my Somali heritage and both in my Western community, which I was growing up. So I was very loud. And it's really interesting. One of the things that my community has, and one of the, I think, a global pandemic that has inflicted women for a long time, is the concept of shame. Yeah. So when I first started talking about FGM, I was asked, I was told Bala Hishod, which means to have no shame. And I was told, do you have no shame in terms of talking about this? And I realized that actually I had nothing to be ashamed of. It was so my ignorance was nothing to be ashamed of, because I was asking questions about the actual act of FGM was something that I had nothing to do with, nothing I chose. So I wasn't ashamed of that. I shouldn't be ashamed of that. And the idea that I was born with a female anatomy was something also I shouldn't be ashamed of, because that's how God made me. So I think I have, I am one of the African women who was raised within a family that had women that had kind of pushed forward every single generation for me.
And just give me a little bit of context with what happened to you. Was the driver religious? Was it culture? What was it?
I think it was culture and more about identity, but in a way which it was very much about the fact that, so I come from a community where 98% of women have undergone FGM. So I've never, this is how common it is within my family and my community, is that I've never known and loved a woman that has not undergone FGM. So I think the idea of the fact that my mother and my grandmother would be able to break the cycle of FGM and really see it beyond something that actually just happened to them, something that always happened to their families, and something that which was part of becoming a woman within our culture was kind of a fallacy. And I think it was quite ignorant of me to assume those things. And in really searching for answers, I realized that what my mother gave me was she was unable as a 27-year-old to stop me from having FGM because that's what the culture deemed. But she had the ability to have me freely educated and get to the point where I could understand and really put a finger on FGM as being an oppressive form of violence, as opposed to something that I should be proud of and identify with. And I remember when I first articulated those words as FGM being akin to rape and other things, it was really interesting. The two pushbacks that I got back was, one was from the African women that I was around that loved me and said, well, do not compare the brutality of rape, which is done by white men. And that is also really interesting, where a lot of our community always think that if anything to do with FGM is all to do with the devil, is either to do with the devil or it's something that is not African, it's something that's coming from somewhere else. So it's another culture that does rape. And then when I said FGM was violence against women and girls to a white, very privileged and very afraid with feminist community, it was very much like, oh, well, it can't be violence against women and girls because Africans don't have the ability to have the concept of oppressing women. They must be doing it through ignorance. And I used to sit there thinking, no, I think you have to make several conscious decisions in order to tie a child down and cut its anatomy and then sell the story of this being part of your culture and being part of your identity. That actually takes a lot of intellectual thought to really do that. So it's really interesting where the African female body really fits in, because it's one which has never been allowed to define itself within a global community. And then so that means that we're always talked about and talked at and never allowed to really speak for ourselves. So yeah, very much objectified and very much a product to be studied from an anthropological aspect. And I think for me, that is what really infuriated me about really talking about FGM at the beginning, was that I'd spent almost 20 years until I opened my mouth publicly to talk about my own experience of FGM, to say, like, you know, it's violence against women and girls. What happened to me was horrific. What happened to me was because of my gender. And I think that really took a lot of academics back, because they weren't comfortable with an African woman articulating those kind of thoughts.
It's so interesting. And is it that, again, just to stay here in this place for a minute, is it that Western audiences can see it as negative and harmful, but don't think we have the wherewithal to kind of see it as such, that we have to be told? I mean, I don't quite understand where they feel that we sit in the conversation about FGM.
Yeah, definitely. So they sit in the sense that we must be doing it because we don't understand it's wrong. So the concept of conscious continuously wanting to raise awareness and wanting to advocate on our behalf, rather than actually really understanding that it was African women that went to the UN and asked for FGM to be defined as a global health pandemic. And even that actually is quite problematic, was the fact that we look at FGM as a health issue rather than a human rights issue. So it wasn't about the world coming together and saying we need to protect the dignity and the humanity of African women. It was like, oh, this thing is actually hurting African women when they're giving birth. How do we make it so they're not dying giving birth? Because that's the main issue, which has led to the medicalization of FGM. So when I tell people the physicality of FGM is bad, but the psychological and the actual economic and real oppression of women is a terrible thing, that seems like I'm like, you know, an alien language to a lot of people.
Let's pause there for a second. I just want to say thank you to everybody who's watching, who's tuned in. Send your questions, send your comments. We do the show in this format because we want this to be a dialogue. So we want to hear your voices from wherever you're watching around the world. Send your thoughts so we can weave them into the conversation. So Nimco, I want to just double down on this issue of the harm caused by FGM, because, you know, there are those who say it's not harmful. And I just need, there's nothing really that I could say that would drive that point home. I come from listen, I'm also very open. I write about this in my book. I come from a family where my mother was cut. One of my grandmothers was a cutter. I wasn't cut, but it is something in the country of Sierra Leone, where I'm from, more than 85% of women are said to have been cut. The numbers are perhaps even higher than that.
Yeah.
And there is a strain of thought that it is not harmful. Can you address that? Take all the time you need.
Yeah, well, obviously it is harmful because what you're doing is subjecting a child or a woman to an unnecessary, procedure, which is mutilating the female anatomy to a non-healthy stage. So the idea, the fact that if we were going around saying that we were going to poke the eyes out of people, or it's not really harmful because that part of the body is going to heal. Because if you do amputate or mutilate like the eye, it heals, but you still have one eye left. It's like we would not be here having that conversation. When it comes to women, we're always constantly having to explain why the brutality and the acts of harm that are being done to them are actually harmful, rather than actually seeing it for itself. Taking a blade to a healthy piece of tissue and cutting it for no reason other than for men's sexual pleasure or for standing within a community does not make any sense. And it wouldn't make sense if that was happening to all of the gender, but because it's happening to women, we're in this intellectual conversation about what is the harm. But for me, it's also not just about the physical harm, it's also about the social harm that caused. If you are basing the value of girls, and this is one of the things that I really found problematic growing up here in the West, where well-educated, well-meaning white people would say things which I would stand back and say, why would you say that? So I would talk, people would explain the reasons for FGM. And imagine saying nobody would say that the reasons for rape or the reasons for domestic violence. We know that that there are no excuses for any form of violence. And one of the key things, because I come from a community that practices a very invasive form of FGM, which is called infibulation, which is where the anatomy is stitched together. And the global average age of FGM is 5, but in my community, just like when I had it, I was 7 years old. So it was really interesting for a professional, an English professional, British person to tell me, oh, the reason why FGM is done for at such a young age is for chastity. So listen to that. You're talking about the sexual relationship that I'm like, who the hell am I going to have? Who am I? I'm 7 years old. Yeah. Why does my anatomy need to be stitched together in order for me to stay to have my to stay checked? Who am I having sex with? Who am I being protected from? So we also know that within those kind of concepts being the norm, that there is predatory behavior from men within the community that would actually be sexually attracted to young women. So if they're not stitched up, because women are seen as property of the man and as property of the family and not a property of the state. So that's another fundamental thing. The African women are very rarely seen as citizens. They're always seen as assets of community.
Belonging to someone.
Exactly. And never belonging to themselves and never having the ability to be able to democratically partake and be an individual within the country. So the fact that you're subjecting a citizen to a non-medical procedure means that you're devaluing that citizen. So when we talk about issues like domestic violence, we talk about rape, we talk about women dying in birth, if you are not valuing a 5-year-old child, there is no way you are going to be valuing the 15-year-old girl, the 11-year-old you want to send to education, the women that need. So the only it's really funny, the only time that African men want to start investing in healthcare or women's health or women's bodies at all is when they're pregnant. And the pregnancies are more about the child than they are about the birth of the mother. So when you look at maternal health rates, we always talk about how many children die, not how many women are butchered, trying to save children that belong to men, because it's the name and the lineage that's going to carry on. So for me, FGM, as somebody that has physically felt the pain of it, it's painful. It it harms you. I will never have the natural anatomy of another that I was born with, but ultimately also corrodes the morals of a society. Yeah. I honestly think that if you are okay with screaming children being held down, having their anatomy mutilated, then that does something to your psyche. That does something to the point where you become numb to the idea of ever respecting anybody. So I do think that, we're not going to be able to end other forms of gender-based violence in Africa unless we end FGM, unless we stop brutally subjecting young girls to a human right violation just so we can sell them for 2 cows, or just so your honor and your ego as a man can be upheld because she hasn't had the audacity to act on her desire to have sex with somebody who she might consently want to have sex with. So, and for African women to say that, so for me as being an activist, it's been really an interesting and a painful journey to find my own voice, but also for that voice to be constantly silenced by people in the development sector who want to be able to not offend. I always hear, oh, we can't call it mutilation because we don't want to offend. I'm like, if your biggest problem is not offending somebody that wants to hold 6-year-old girls down, then you're not on the side of the person that needs to be defended within this kind of moment. So this idea that Africans don't know what they're doing, or FGM is something that happens out of ignorance, is something that is very much endorsed by those that are pro FGM, because they want to pretend they're ignorant. They want to pretend, come here and spend another 3-4 million educating us, telling us it's wrong, because we might then all of a sudden, oh my God, we are gonna stop cutting our girls because you told me it's bad. So, literally, it's
what I do want to ask you is, as you talk about, it means I pulled my plug here, as you talk about white, Western audiences, Western women trying to silence you, or men and women, what about African women who try to silence you?
I think a lot of the things with the African women that try to silence me, I'm not necessarily as angry. So one of the things that I realized through my journey is that I remember when I first became very emotional about my FGM. So because I think my emotional reaction was very much stunted until I was in my early to mid teens. And then I remember demanding an apology from my mother, said I wanted an apology and I wanted an apology. And it took me to about 2016 when I went back to my birthplace of Hargeisa and in Somaliland, having conversations with women. And I had a conversation with a cutter, and I basically got the emotional power to be able to see a cutter for the first time. And I remember thinking that actually I am beyond FGM, so I hold the power now. So I said to one of the cutters, I said, she made the usual excuse of, oh, I cut these girls because I don't have any money, otherwise this is the only way that I can live, and this is the only way that I can eat. And she was telling this to a massive aid, meeting, and they were all nodding, doing the, yes, we need to find the alternative means of giving this woman employment, which is fine. I agree with the fact that we do need to find women actual economic empowerment. So then I said to the woman off-site, I said, did you cut your daughter? And she said, yes. I said, did you cut your granddaughter? And she said, yes. And I said, but who paid you for that? And she said, nobody. And I said, can I say to you, the reason why you don't put down the blade is because the memories and the pain of the millions, or the hundreds of girls you've mutilated and some even murdered will come, coming back to you, will become something that you have to deal with. So the reality is, when African women are angry about me talking about my FGM, it's because I'm in a position that they haven't got to. It is literally like reading out your diary in the middle of a sixth form, dorm room. You don't want everybody to hear about issues and emotional things that you haven't been able to deal with. And for me to stand there and tell non-African women and community people our deepest, darkest secret, it's something that you don't want to laugh with me and you don't want to join me. What you want to do is to put your mouth around to put your hand around my mouth and silence me. So African women, I understand that their pain and their anger is not with me, it's with themselves, and it's with the fact that they haven't been given the ability to psychologically heal. It's still wrong. A lot of them do sometimes side with the oppressor, and I'm not excusing them, but I understand that a little bit more than when it's men or when it's Western communities who basically want to be able to kind of pretend that FGM is this kind of ignorant thing that, as though it's malaria, we can eradicate it with a vaccine or something.
Let me read you this comment that was sent in by Prince Commander. Thank you for writing in, Prince. He says, let's get the narrative right. The practice is primitive and unnecessary, but it is not about the predatory acts of men. It is just a primitive practice, and it should be called as such. As a man, even as a young boy, I was against my sisters going through the practice. It pained me when my parents allowed my sisters to go through that barbaric practice. I was in my teens and was pretty much aware that it was an evil practice. What do you say about to that? That he's saying it's not about the predatory instincts of men.
Well, it is about the predative instincts of men in terms of when war breaks out, where girls are either being forced into child marriage to protect them from rape, or they're having very invasive form of FGM. And it's really not that primitive when we're actually medicalizing FGM. So the fastest growing forms of FGM on the continent of Africa, within places like Egypt, Sudan, even in Somaliland, in Kenya, is the medicalization of FGM. Because what we've done is we've talked about the harm of FGM, not the wrongness of FGM. Mm-hmm. So this idea of the fact that FGM is primitive and happens to people that can't read or write, or ignorant people, is a fallacy, because we are having FGM in medical settings. Indonesia, Malaysia, which are almost first world countries, have almost 50% uptake of FGM because of the fact that it's a medicalized procedure. So it is deep rooted in this. Do you know what? It's to do with the predatory nature of men, and it's all to do with the masculinity. And again, another kind of conversation is that we believe that concept of masculinity, femininity, and ego only belong within the Western concept. Mm-hmm. Men, the male ego is a massive thing, and this idea of the fact that men have to protect their honor, and their honor always exists through the vessel of the woman, and we are the objects. And that object has to be subjected to the way that they deem us to be representative of their community. And if they think that FGM is what deems him to be a man, he would do that. As a Muslim woman, one of the things that I always find fascinating is that people always talk about the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he had many sunnahs, but one of the things that they always want to keep is the ability to be able to marry 4 women. Mm-hmm. And I was like, there are many sunnahs that you can choose from. You don't have to choose the one that oppresses women. Mm-hmm. So it is about ego, and men have to, and we have to be able to understand that African men rape, African men abuse. And for me, ironically, within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the key principles for me is the fact that I wish the humanity and the lives of Black women matter to Black men.
Agreed.
That, for me, that is the fundamental thing, is the fact that I am more likely to be raped, murdered, abused, oppressed at the hands of an African or a Black man than I am at the hands of a white man. And we spend so much of our energy having conversations about the empire, which was 300 years ago, and really not looking at the brutality that our own brothers and our own fathers.
And nobody's going to rally. Let me just say, because I have this conversation a lot of time. It's unlikely there'll be a rally when, we are raped and mutilated and cast aside, right? Yeah. It's unlikely it's going to trigger mass outrage. And that bothers me deeply, because again, it comes back to the value of women in this movement and in society. And just to pick up on the point you made about men's egos and those being valued and prized, and it being reflected in their women who are vessels. There's a reason why in conflict we see these mass rapes, and we see the kind of violence wrought on women. It is because it is an understanding that women are prized, they are possessions, and by attacking them and destroying them, if you will, it's the easiest way to man's ego.
Yeah, basically it's your property. If I can't take your land, I'll take your woman.
Yeah,
because and it was one of the issues. I had a conversation with one of my friends. We were talking about defining rape as a genocide. So somebody called rape as a genocide, and I said, but the idea is but then you're only saying the fact that only the male identity exists within that. So within the mass rape in Rwanda and everything else, everyone wanted to call it a genocide because they were wiping out specific clans. And I said, but the reality is, then does the mother of the child not carry an identity? And it's the same thing that's happening with the Yazidi women that have been enslaved. Those Yazidi women have been raped, enslaved for almost 3.5 years. but if they have children, they can't come back because those children are not Yazidi. And I'm just thinking, like, my God, like, it is still the ego of men to say that you're not going to bring someone else's seed, even though it's 50% that woman, she carried that seed with her. So I think for me, like, Africa and African men specifically, Africa needs us, like, some therapy. I think we need to do a psyche, like a psychological analysis of why we are so brutal to ourselves. Like, when I read about the brutality of things that happen in places like Sierra Leone or places like the Congo, Somalia, it's just like, these are our people. Like, what is like, what makes you think it's okay to do that? And it's also, for me, I come from a community where, again, like I said, rape only exists within the context of, well, it's either the white people or someone that's possessed, rather than it could be our uncles and our our brothers.
Yeah. Let me read these comments coming in from Alimatu Demonic. I never get her name right. I think it's Demon Kene. Alimatu, you have to forgive me if I get it wrong. She says there's a war in our bodies, mostly in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Aminata Radio says absolutely, it's steeped in the culture, so no one cares. And just Prince Commander's asking, why do you think some African men behave the way they do to women? Is it because of poverty? But then again, that's excusing people and saying,
like, I've known many poor people that didn't rape. And this is the whole thing, is like, so I've known, like, poverty has existed for millennia. I think it's impunity. I think it's the reason why people, like, men rape is because of, like, because the fact that they're not being held accountable, and because of this conversation of, like, we as women have to bear the pain of the shame that is inflicted upon us. And also, there has been a massive disservice done to African women because they've had to survive through millennia of abuse and horror that we are seen as some kind of superheroes. And I really want to get that narrative correct, the fact that African women are not superheroes because we've always been left behind and we had to survive. So the idea, the fact that we've lived through civil war, poverty, deprivation, all these things does not mean we're superhuman. It just means the fact that we just had to survive.
I was going to say, it just means we have to go on. It's not because it's superheroes. Just give me some numbers. My understanding is that FGM is known to be prevalent in 27 African countries, as well as Indonesia, Yemen, and Iraqi Kurdistan. Can you just give me a sense of the state of play right now, and what links, is there a common link between the countries where it's still prevalent? I mean, as you look at the map.
Yeah, so it's 28 countries to 29 countries, and globally there's around 200 million women, but those 200 million women are aged between 14 and 49, so within the childbearing ages. And between now and 2030, before the global COVID pandemic, there was almost 70 million girls at risk of FGM. I think that is probably going to go up because of the fact that there's going to be more births, because there's more teenage pregnancies and there's more child marriage. I think what really links all those places is most of the high prevalence in the world are in Africa, and it's just like it's a complete and utter disregard for the value of women or the existence and the humanity of women. But they always say we love our women, our women are the best, but then also never ever give a second thought to FGM, child marriage, polygamy, rape, domestic violence, all those kind of things. So I think what really links us is the inability for us to really value our women, and also for us to, as women within those countries, to actually collectively go beyond the conversation of shame and start to unite. I think that is what links the whole narrative, is the fact that every woman that speaks up about her FGM experience comes under the kind of barrier of, like, breaking the code of silence around not talking about our shame and not talking about our issues and not talking about anatomy, and then that basically just keeps the myths going. I think it's fear of. So there's a quote that I always kind of butcher, but it says, "Solemn do you see the potential of a man in a boy, but you always fear the woman in a girl." And within I think, like, some of the greatest men I've known are African men, But I'm sorry to say, most of the African men that I know and most of the African men on the African continent have fragile egos. They cannot deal with women who can be their equal or can be their leaders. So I think um, terrible leadership and very, like, shallow egos of men are what really links it. And I wish I didn't need to say that about my African brothers, but it is like egotistical, the fact that you would, like, it's the same thing as like they assume that every single, like, every African woman is, it's their property. So living in the West, when you see an African woman with a non-African man, it's like the African man takes offense, as though it's like his opinion to take offense, as though we shouldn't have a choice. So there is this sense of ownership and this sense of like, you belong to me, so therefore I reject you, and then my other brother can do that. So there is, I think, we have to, as Gloria Steinem said, we just don't have to raise our girls to be strong. We have to raise our boys to be vulnerable, and I think that is what is missing on the African continent. It's kind and vulnerable men.
I 100% agree. I do want to talk though about the fact that this is not just a problem that we're seeing in Africa. Even in the UK, between January and March 2019, the NHS reported nearly, was it 2,000 cases where women and girls were identified to have had FGM. Talk to me about the export of the practice to Western settings.
Yeah, so a lot of the export has kind of died down. So a lot of those women, and that conversation is that women that were identified, so basically their first entry points or their first FGM being recorded within the NHS. So a lot of the women that have, like, probably all of that 2,000 women are women that were probably cut before they came to the UK and settled as British citizens. But there is still a massive, so it's really interesting. So 40% of the FGM population in the UK is Somali, and FGM within the Somali community is going down because we found other ways to control women, which is the burqa, or like, narrative interpretation of Islam, and like, so we found other forms of chastisation. That's why people say why there's no FGM in places like Saudi. I'm like, the whole Saudi culture oppresses women. There still is evidence now that there is FGM, but I'm saying to the whole point of finding other ways of really controlling the ability of women to be really successful. So FGM, like, extraterritorial cutting within the UK is changing, but in the early 2000s, a lot of them, like, mostly Somali migrants that came from European countries like Holland, Sweden, as soon as they came to the UK, they basically took their girls abroad and had them cut, because it was still an idea of the fact that this is what it looks like to be a Somali woman. And because our parents and our grandparents haven't been able to do the work in order to heal their own trauma, the easiest way to legitimize something that you felt is to repeat it. And I think there's a massive psychological connection to that. And I think we have to, like, stop thinking that African women and the way that Africa has, like, a form of abuse in different ways is not linked to a psychological issue. I think that is, for me, it's like, I don't think a sane person. So one of the stories I once read about the Congo was like these men that were wearing the knickers of the women they raped. And it was like everybody else was telling it in a very anecdotal kind of conversation, and it's the incredible doctor whose name I forgot that won the Nobel Peace Prize. He was operating on a girl that was raped, and it was and he was operating with a French doctor who came to assist him, a white French doctor, and he said, I really want to find the man that did this, and I really want to just like I really want to have brutally attack him. And then the Frenchman said to him, oh, you don't really mean to get that angry. And he said, we have to get angry about the way that our men are treating our girls, because it's a psychological issue. I think there is a massive disconnect with with the humanity of our people and the way that we exist as Africans. And I think that is something that we have to talk about, the psychological experiences that many have had on the continent for the last 4 decades.
I've interviewed Denny Mukwege, who runs the Panzi Hospital in DRC, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he said when he sees the level of destruction to female bodies, like, part of him kind of can't reconcile the fact that the men who are perpetrating these acts of violence are of women. They have mothers. They have. There has to be a psychological kind of impairment or kind of like psychic trauma that could possibly, like, I remember him saying, I just don't understand. You could do this, and some of them take, guns and insert them in women and fire them off to completely destroy them.
That level of hate and brutality does actually mean that, the person has to be psychologically ill. So I think the whole point is the fact that we have to talk about what, I've never really seen anybody talk about the emotional well-being of Africans. And I think for me, that is the main thing, is the fact that we have generations of young women who are told, that rape is a norm, and generations of young men who are told to rape is the norm. And I think that is not okay.
To discount the will of women, right?
Yeah.
In every way. And if that means you want sexual gratification, you want sexual gratification, and the will of a woman doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
So I want to read this comment made by Gloria Kinghoff. Indeed, African women are strong. Men in Africa get away with these atrocities. Worked with a large group of African refugees as a school nurse in Texas. Parents were going to jail left and right for rape and molestation of our female students by fathers and family members. Mothers were arrested for not reporting the crime. You mentioned at the beginning of this conversation about, the expression that you have in your community of have you no shame, and this kind of desire for silence. The silence around whether it's FGM or the silence around the violence that women and girls suffer. I mean, again, how do we break that? Or is it just, how do we break that where there isn't the will to be silent?
Yeah, I think it's so we have to create a tsunami. So when I think we need an African Me Too movement. I think that's why in the sense of the fact that it came to the Western community as well. So let's not, rape and domestic violence and all these things are happening globally. But I think the difference is that we just focus on the most brutal one and we forget about all the other ones that are happening around those communities and around those kind of areas. So I think we have to have a Me Too we have to have a Me Too movement. And the reality is that I know many, recently there were, within the Somali community, there was a Somali Me Too moment where a lot of girls were talking about being sexually harassed or assaulted within the mosques and when they were younger children. And it's one of those things, they knew that nobody would believe them, so they never said it. So a lot of them spoke up. A lot of them talked about family abuse and all these things. And I said, this is what it's about. It's about I know countless Somali girls who've been raped, but I don't happen to know a Somali man that's ever been convicted of rape unless he's raped an English woman and somebody else reports him. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the things about my community, is the fact that if a girl decides not to become a nurse, it's shocking. But if a boy decides to rape women, then we're all ready to hide his embarrassment and send him back home with a lot of money and marry him off to another girl to rehabilitate him. We are sometimes I do think it's not about the women that that tell me not to speak about FGM, but sometimes it's the women that are complicit in the silencing of our other sisters, in the sense when it's your son, when it's all these things. There are very few people that will say that if a woman came up to me and said that your brother had raped her, that they would believe that woman. And I was thinking, but you can't be in a situation where you say that you're a feminist and you believe in the Me Too movement, but you won't believe other things. So I think we do need a Time's Up and a Me Too movement on the African continent. I think Time's Up, firstly, for the lack of leadership on the continent. I think we've had almost 60 years of men passing the baton to another man, and very few of them actually really taking responsibility of 50% of the population, which is women, and therefore ensuring that those countries stay in poverty. So that's the same thing. And we need a moment for sisters to actually just to say that there's nothing to be embarrassed about. That that 1 in 3 women, actually sometimes 1 in 2 women globally has been a victim of sexual violence, and it's sadly it's the norm, and we are living with our perpetrators. We're loving our perpetrators, ironically. So
we're coming out into the streets to fight for our perpetrators in in some ways, right? Like these movements. And I'm not saying that when horrible things happen to black men, we shouldn't, stand to fight for justice. But again, back to your point, and really what underpins all of this is the horrible things that happen to black women and girls do not generate the same mass outrage, same desire to fight to the end for change. And that I spend a lot of time ranting around this, Nimco.
No, it is, and I think we have to say that. I think I have to say that when I keep being told that my greatest enemy is, within the United Kingdom, white privileged men, I'm like, they are not my enemy, because it's. So I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and I said that a senior person, you can even talk about any politician within the United Kingdom, one of the most senior politicians in the United Kingdom, in his country, if he puts his hands on me, there's legislation for me to say that he can't do that. Even me, as a former child refugee in his country, I couldn't take him to court and have him arrested. In the country of my birth, the only reason why my rape and my murder would be looked into is it's because of the privilege and the name that I have through my family, and that wouldn't even be a legal thing. It would be men in my community being offended. How dare you murder my property? And I was trying to tell this to a Somali guy to try to get him to understand, to say that when it comes to the West, they are ahead. Even when it comes to things like child molestation, they have legislation around it. They at least admitted that we have issues with pedophiles. So we bring in criminal justice legislation that says something about that. In Africa, in my countries that call themselves 100% Muslim, it's heaven forbid, it doesn't exist. Of course it exists. It's a reality. So it's like, how do we become how do we become honest to say that, that our men rape? I think that's as basic as that.
I want to read this from Daka Selena Kroma, who's a young activist in Sierra Leone. She says, silence is the greatest catalyst to all forms of inhumane and barbaric abuse against women and girls. How can we fight back when our abusers are our families and loved ones?
And that's what I mean. I think we have to be able to. I think the social media is powerful. I think we can actually create an earthquake in terms of actually just sharing our stories and collecting that. And that's why I wanted to, because I wanted to write this book, and it was going to be funny, and it was going to be about periods, it's going to be about sex, it's going to be all those things. But it actually became women wanting to tell their deepest, darkest secrets. And it was like things, and every single woman started off with saying, well, I shouldn't really talk about this, but let me tell you. And it was that whole point of we all, I think, collectively want to be able to relieve ourselves of stories of horror, and we want those stories, and we want our pain to matter, and we want it to be legitimized. And I think for me, again, even when I'm talking about FGM, it was I was in a world where, my Somali community thought I was crazy for saying FGM was painful and wrong. And the white community, British community I grew up with, was saying I was crazy. I just wanted my pain to be legitimized, because it was just it was painful. And I wanted that to feel like, yeah, it's okay for you to say something is painful and not to own it or think it's something incredible. I think that, this is an incredible platform. I think it's about collecting our stories on a social media platform to share it, to say, African women will rise together, and we won't judge each other. And we won't silence each other, and we won't think less of each other if we do come forward about our sexual history, the offences that have been committed against us. I think the term survivor is powerful. We've survived.
Yeah.
But how do we heal, and how do we thrive? I want women to thrive. I just don't want African sisters to survive. I want them to thrive.
Let me read this by Alex Pratt. He says that older women have been indoctrinated and see FGM as normal. And if another woman does not take part in FGM, she will be seen as impure and an outcast. Well, I guess that's me. So, I mean, again, it's part of, the women and who helped keep this going. Talk to me about your effort. I mean, the goal is 2030, right?
Yeah.
With whatever SDGs, to have this eliminated. Talk to me about the reality.
So you know what? The reality is that if we invest in African women, if we trust African women as being the answers to the solution to the issue, then we will be able to end FGM by 2030. So for me, at the Five Foundation, which is the global partnership to end FGM, for me, it's about Africa's female future. That is the fundamental thing that I am about honing and supporting. Africa is the youngest continent on the planet, and the reality is that if we invest in those women who've already undergone FGM, who are the next generation of women who are going to have children, but give them the opportunity to have economic empowerment. So at the Five Foundation, we have two funds. We're setting up two funds, one with Global Fund for Women, for activists. So we've got women that are risking their lives on a day-to-day basis, fighting, going to communities, advocating, having the conversation, because activists have to hold their government accountable. So they have to be able to lobby. They have to hold their communities accountable. So that has to happen. So we need to fund that. But then we also need to fund microfinancing. And I had the most incredible call with an African banker yesterday, and I said to him, while FGM is carrying on, Africa will never prosper. One of the things that all the countries that carry out FGM have in common because of FGM is they're all poor, and they're all struggling. And that's because they've broken 50% of their human capital. They've subjected to FGM and seen them as nothing more than to be valued as wives and as mothers, and not as citizens and active things. But we want to be able to really start economically empowering women, because when you have economic empowerment, when you have money, you have choices. And that is what happened in this side of the world. This is what happened in the United Kingdom. You can trace the history of a white working class woman from East London who basically had to work in the workhouses, had no family, had nothing, would get married, would have countless kids and die, and then there would be a routine of poverty. That woman being able to make her own money, that woman being able to ensure that when her daughter was able to go to school, her daughter was able to not just make her own money, but also to open a bank account. And now their granddaughters are at Oxford and Cambridge, and they're FTSE 100 CEOs. We can Africa can develop the same way. I think there are two narratives of Africa which are quite problematic. One is the one that God love Beyonce, great artist, but she fetishizes Africa as some kind of fantasy land, which is all about which is as though it is Wakanda. Africa exists. Africa is a continent on this planet. And then the next one is it's the anthropological look, where they want to be able to study Africa and see where humanity started and really just keep trying to rescue us. Those two things don't work. Africa, given the same opportunities and the same infrastructure as the UK and other G7 countries have been given, can develop. We've seen places
leadership, though. It's leadership. Everything you're saying is tied to leadership.
I know, but that leadership. So the whole point is one of those things, because a lot of these African men can't deal with the idea of that. If I start talking about empowering women to become leaders and to become presidents and all these things, I think we'll all be shot. So I always say, don't bring a knife to a gunfight. Honestly, I keep saying that if my grandmother was as outspoken as I was, she'd be dead. But she pushed forward every generation so I could be at the point where I had the freedom to be this loud and to be able to survive, and then my niece could be even more freer. So we do need leadership, but we need the ability for them to be held accountable at the moment. So I don't think any of the African leaders are going to be stepping down anytime soon, but we need the G7 to say, for me, it's if you don't want economic migrants, if you don't want climate refugees, if you don't want people leaving the continent of Africa, stop the aid industry, which is actually quite colonial, and actually start investing in Africa, start trading in Africa. Have the new head of the World Trade Organization to be an African woman that led a financial institution that actually understands that Nigeria's population, because of the fact that we're not economically empowering women and we're not supporting them, will have a population of 500 million by 2050. Nigeria is not going to be able to handle that. Where are they going to come? They're going to come knocking on your door. So we have to be able to tell these G7 leaders, if you don't want your biggest nightmares to come true, you have to invest in women in Africa. You have to be able to empower them, and they will have fewer children, have sustainable food and resources around them. Then they'll even keep your bloody elephants and tigers and all these things that you want to come see alive. So for the I know, I rant as well. Like I'm
No, you may. It's okay. I mean, I feel it's a kindred spirit. Go ahead and rant. I just laughed at the elephants
no,
because you
no, but
said keep the elephants.
but it's one of the things is the fact that you have a conversation with some, like, with these great financiers. So there was a conversation the other day about like how do we save elephants and how do we save trees? And I said, well, you say if I'm a woman that's hungry and doesn't have any food, I'm going to kill the elephant and I'm going to cook it on the tree. So it's the whole point is that we need to economically empower women, and that's how. So basically, the five foundations, two kind of means or ways of doing it is through really putting power and money at the hands or in the hands of women and in communities. So setting up a microfinancing fund which will ensure that we can actually build capacity in Africa and finance and support women-led businesses that are, most of those women are FGM survivors. And the second fund, which is with Global Fund for Women, is to set up a fund that supports activists, because these activists have to hold their leaders accountable, because we are constantly asking the UN to be able to hold African leaders to accountable, and like the African leaders are still going to get their checks, so they don't really care when they go to
they'll just say the right things while they're in the room, and then when they leave, everything goes back to normal. Which brings me to the question of laws and legislation. I mean, it's all well and good to have the laws on the books, but I mean, it's about implementation, and it's really about changing the culture.
But I think legislation is the beginning of a conversation. So if legislation is passed, then you basically set the moral tone of a country. So the whole point is like murder, rape, everything else is illegal here in the UK. But the whole point is it still happens and people are still prosecuted. The reality is to set a piece of legislation basically gives the moral and the kind of the tone of what a country thinks. So if an African leader says, I want to end FGM, I want all girls to go to school, I want this, and he actually sets the tone that this is a guy that believes in democracy and believes in gender equality at the heart of that, which at the moment very few African leaders have actually, very few, close to none, have actually publicly said that. They can make statements in if you are at an FGM conference and you say something about FGM, it's not really that surprising that you're going to say something about FGM. But if you are at Unger or you're somewhere else and you're being told what are the important things to you, if you say that I want to be able to invest in the other 50% of my capital, I want to be able to elevate African women to the point of being actual active citizens within my country, because therefore I believe that is how I'm going to get prosperity. Like Ghana is an example. That's like the jewel of the place. Botswana. Like there are incredible places that are really reinvested in their people and they've become really successful. But what has happened is that a lot of our leaders have become very much aid dependent and very much China dependent, and China and the aid industries are not interested in democracy.
No,
it is not the role. It is not the role of a charity. They will say to come in and talk about democracy, and well, we know what China is all about, and it's definitely not democracy.
So we've actually, this has gone by so quickly. We've only got 4 minutes left, and a lot of people just saying I want to read some of the comments. Soroba Special Kamara, good to see women supporting women. Ali Master is also right, so proud to be a grantee from a girl at a time. Alex Pratt, get rid of those men in power. More women need to be in powerful positions in Africa. This point that was made by someone saying that, and in fact, Ali Master made it, replying to Beindu Luawa. Educated women in Sierra Leone are the biggest group doing FGM. Yeah. I've been talking a lot about Sierra Leone because of what happened to little Khadija. As we try and grapple with dismantling a rape culture, dismantling a culture that again sees women as property, sees females as being put on this earth to gratify men. I mean, what should that fight look like for all those activists who are sitting in Sierra Leone right now, who want to do something after what happened to Khadija, which really is just the tipping point. It's been happening for a long time. You're an activist. What do you say to those activists on the ground there who are trying to grapple with these issues?
I think speak up. I think that is the first thing, is the fact that it's like speak up and reach out. I think we do have to, like somewhere like Sierra Leone, because there is also a very much organized pushback against women. I think we have to be able to organize a call out, and we have to be able to hold Sierra Leone. Like, you can't have a president and the first lady talking about hands off our girls when they're actually not doing anything to that. So there are ways to really be able to hold them account, whether it's through the Commonwealth, whether it's through other places of like, that are getting the donations to them. It is really sad to say, but hit them where it hurts, and most of that it's in their pocket to these African leaders. If like, you and I are both two women that have a voice and have a privilege, we could. I really do want to write an open letter about the way that people are funding and what's happening. I would love to write to companies or people that want to invest in places like these countries where girls are being raped, and say, do you know that you are basically fueling rape culture? You're fueling a community and a culture which actually does not value women. Trust me, that will get these leaders to act. As soon as people stop pulling out, start to pull out, they will do that. We also have to understand there probably might be, China might slip in, so we have to have a massive issue, like conversation about China. But ultimately, we have the ability to be able to stop their paychecks, because what they care about at the moment is not the humanity and the dignity of our women. Is what they care about is about their paychecks. And I negotiate with a lot of leaders on a day-to-day basis, and very few of those are actually there to talk about FGM as a horrific issue. I've met more white privileged men who are more horrified and say they want to do something than African men, which is quite depressing. Mm-hmm. But what these African men care about is about platform and privilege. So if they want to be able to hold platform and privilege, then they have to be able to hold that with clean hands. And at the moment they don't. So let's shame our leaders. I'm happy to, like, in this global community where we all have platforms, or we're all able to do shame our communities. Hollywood did that. I want to bring back the whole Me Too thing. Yeah. Harvey Weinstein thought he was untouchable. Yeah. So the reality is that these African leaders are not untouchable, and they can be made unwelcome in London, in Paris, and all these places which they think that they're big men in. If they're not allowed to come to the big places in the world, then it basically trickles back down that they're nothing but little men. So again, it is about going for their ego, which is a bit scary. But I do think, we want to be able to support these activists. Speak up, share your stories, and for us African women that have massive platforms and privileges, I think it is for us to hold them accountable. I have never shied away from, every time I see an African leader who I have an issue with, or even a Western leader, reminding them of the issue that I have, or reminding them of not shaking their hand, because I know that they are not doing anything. So I think between you and I, we can probably blacklist a few African leaders from a few parties until they do things.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
So that's the kind of thing I'm all about, blacklisting them. Yeah.
Let's make the change. Listen, it's time. At the end of the day, if you have a platform, it is incumbent upon you, incumbent upon us to make a change, and to really be on the front lines to bring that change about, because
exactly. Let's use our privilege and our platform. And I think the idea is that we always assume that it's white people that are privileged. We hold privilege, African women, and I think let's collectively use that. And to every single woman that's listening, please don't feel ashamed about the experiences that you've had. There's nothing wrong with you. And this is a long road, but I believe that we're going to win. And I do believe that there is more good in our men in Africa. At the moment, there happens to be a lot of weak men leading us, but there is a lot of good on our continent, and I think we will overcome. But I think in order to do that, we have to work together.
Let's do it. Nimka Ali, I was reading earlier on about you, and I think it's your unofficial title, Chief Fanny Defender, which I just thought was perfect. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm going to be in touch, and I look forward to the next steps.
No, definitely. I'm really excited. Yeah, I think we can do this.
I think we can. Thank you. Thank you for being a voice. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. I'm so grateful that you continue to tune in and watch every Wednesday for these deep dives. We'll be back tomorrow with a full show, full home with Isha Sesay. Thank you, everyone. Nimka, thank you to you again. And let's take on the fight. Be safe. Bye, everyone. Bye for now.